But now to engineering. We often hear us being told that we need a lot more engineers. We need engineers for everything. I mean, you can't build a building without an engineer. You can't have a mining project without an engineer. You can't do all sorts of things that are needed to keep this country going without engineers. But we hear there is a shortage. So Matthew Loftes, the Chief Operating Officer of FMG Engineering, is joining us now. What are you going to do to try and encourage more engineering? And do you have to start at the school level or what?
Well, good morning, Ian, and thank you for having me on. I think it has been a long-term problem. We graduate about 900 engineers at the moment in South Australia per annum, and we have needs on a long-term need basis of about 12 to 1,300.
So we're 400 engineers short every year.
On average.
Well, perhaps you should go over to the Murray Park College of Journalism, where I think they're producing about 400 more journalists than they need every year, or to the law school, where they're producing about 400 more lawyers than we need. How do you get the balance right?
Well, I should say that right at the moment, there has been a slight downturn in the construction industry. So right at the moment, there's less vacancies than there has been, but this has been a long-term shortage of engineers, and that will continue. And yes, we need to look at the schools, have more students doing maths and science subjects. There was a tendency probably 10 or 15 years ago for people to tend away from those subjects, but we're really wanting to encourage people back into that field.
Can you just, if there's a parent out there listening today and thinking about engineering as a career for their child, I mean, do people go into things like medicine and dentistry, and they push their kids into that because they say, they're going to have a secure life, they're going to have a good income? Can you say that an engineer would have a secure life and a good income?
Very much so. In fact, the incomes of engineers have increased dramatically over the last 10 years, and really they were at a very low point. So we're looking to improve the salaries of engineers over the long term. And the other thing about engineering, it's an exciting profession. I mean, for those who don't understand, I mean, it's a very broad profession as well. From our perspective in our firm, we're a multidisciplinary firm. We provide engineering across a broad range of areas such as civil, structural, environmental, residential, forensic.
Forensic engineering.
Forensic engineering.
So what's that? Looking at buildings that have got...
looking at failed buildings, so it's damage assessment, looking at remediation.
It was interesting. We're talking to Matthew Loftes, the Chief Operating Officer of FMG. Now, I notice in some of the background material you talk about the waffle...
the waffle pod.
The waffle pod. Now, was that Kookaroo Engineering? Or
that was invented by our company. It was previously named Kookaroo Engineers back in, I think, about 1987.
Because I can remember going and doing an interview with a gentleman, I think somewhere in St. Peter's, when I was working in television, and it was all the houses that were cracking.
Yes.
And he said he had a better way of fixing them, and I think it used about half the amount of
concrete.
Yes. So that's become an international success, is it?
We're looking at about 80% of the homes along the eastern seaboard still are built using the waffle pod technology.
Great. So a South Australian engineering invention, is used in 80% of the new construction on the east coast.
On the east, that's detached homes.
Fantastic.
Yes.
Yes. And I suppose one of the great things about that is that if you think about a waffle, it's got holes in it, but they're not complete holes, are they? So the thing's got strength.
That's right. Well, there's foam placed on the ground, so it saves excavation and reduces the concrete.
Reduces greenhouse gas, the whole lot, so it's a win-win-win. So everyone's using that. That's great. And
it's used, not exclusively, but it's certainly used extensively.
Now, when you talk about career choice, becoming an engineer, would you be able to earn similar salary than, say, a dentist? Would be up there with that? I mean, would you be getting a six-figure salary?
Well, certainly, experienced engineers are certainly earning six-figure salaries. And certainly the earnings of graduates has improved dramatically over the last 5 to 10 years as well. So probably not quite on average, probably not quite the level of dentists and doctors, but certainly up there with
But you could
other
look
professions.
At it, instead of staring into a hole that's about the size of your fist, you'd be staring into a hole the size of, say, the big pit in Western Australia.
Or it could be the size of the new Royal Adelaide Hospital in Adelaide, a pit that size which we did the remediation for. So it's very varied.
Yeah, and I suppose you don't get bored being an engineer because you move from one job to another. You're not doing the same thing. Every time is a different issue, isn't it?
It is indeed. Yes.
And so, are you having difficulty attracting graduates? I mean, how do you go about it? Do you go down to the university and say, "Look, would you like to come and do work experience with us?" Is it?
Well, we do that. We represent ourselves at a number of the universities, and we've recently partnered with Engineers Australia to implement a professional development program. So we've agreed to pay for the development program for all of our people who are willing to undertake that. And that includes their professional, their membership of their professional body.
I think one of the difficulties with the word engineer, though, is it's such a broad term. I mean, John from Para Hill says if the flow of manufacturing out of Australia is threatening the job options for engineers these days, he wants to know whether that's happening. But when we talk about an engineer, are they involved in manufacturing as well, or is that a different term of engineer?
Well, there's many different engineers. We're looking at electronics engineers, mechanical engineers,
civil engineers.
So we're predominantly civil, structural, environmental, but there's engineers across industry.
But in the civil, construction and environmental, you're saying there will always be jobs there. That is part of...
There will always be jobs there. And certainly within Australia, we've seen I guess an issue with engineers being dragged into the mining sector, and for a period that exacerbated the shortage from our perspective. But it's been good for our general economy, of course.
What do you have to study at school to become an engineer these days? Do you still require the basics, the maths, the physics?
Maths, science subjects.
Maths, science subjects.
Physics, yes.
All right. Amy of Gawler has called in on 1300 222 891. We're talking to Matthew Loftes, the Chief Operating Officer of FMG Engineering. Good morning, Amy.
Good morning. I'm a Gen Y female, and I did chemistry, physics, 2 maths and English in Year 12, and so a number of my classmates actually went into engineering.
Okay.
And I'm aware of the different streams, civil and mechanical and electrical and those kind of ones. But I actually really don't know what engineers do, or what their role is, and I think that's a really big problem. I was never attracted to that sort of industry because of a lack of knowledge of what actually occurs.
Well, it's a very good point, Amy, because if you look at engineers as a group, the number of female engineers is minuscule compared to, say, for example, medicine, which I think there's almost 50-50 now.
It's about 15%.
Yeah, so 85% of engineers are men.
That's correct, yeah.
Well, that's a big problem for the
engineering. It is a big problem, yes. And from an industry perspective, we'd like to get more women into our business.
How would you do that? Because Amy said she doesn't know what it is. I mean, that's an issue. And we're also, the other thing that's interesting is that it appears, from what I've been told, that young women, young girls, are doing very well academically at school. So if the brightest and the best are women, and they're going into things like journalism, public relations, business studies, all those medicine, and they're not going to engineers, you're actually missing out on some of the best brains.
We are indeed. And we really want to get that balance in industry too, because in any business, I think you need that balance of male and females.
All right. And Alan of Linton's called in on 1300 222 891. Alan?
Yes, good morning, Ian. After a period of the practicalities of engineering, it would be good if a few of them went into politics, and we might have more sensible discussions. But I think most engineers wouldn't demean themselves to subject themselves to the sort of rubbish that politicians do, so it's unlikely to happen.
All right. Well, I'll ask Matthew. Matthew, are there any engineers that have gone into politics? We're saying maybe we have plenty of lawyers, but what about the engineers?
I'm sure there's plenty. I can't name any at the moment, but
no, I can't think of a person with an engineering.
There's a number of engineers running major companies in Australia, so you'll find that there's quite a high component of CEOs have an engineering background.
Heard a fascinating interview on ABC Radio with the engineer who left Australia and went over and built the London Olympics, and now he's building the high-speed rail network throughout Britain. So, I mean, he started doing engineering in Papua New Guinea. I mean, what a life he's had.
He has.
Do you know the one I'm talking about?
I don't.
But Australian engineers have done very well overseas, haven't they?
Very, very well.
So if someone wants to find out more, you say you're partnering with Engineers Australia. Do you think Engineers Australia should be going around to schools more and saying, look, here's an engineer. Almost like the Army recruiting or the Air Force recruiting. You should be doing a lot more out in the schools?
Very much so. They are doing more in schools, but we need to do even more. and at a young age.
Okay, so if someone's listening to this and they've got a son or a daughter in particular, as we've heard, who are not interested at this stage, could they, for example, go to Engineers Australia and say, look, I'd like to do some work experience with an engineering company. I'd like to go and look at the construction of one of these new buildings and get attached to it. Is that possible?
It is possible, yes.
All right.
They should contact Engineers Australia. For those graduates or people interested, they certainly can contact us.
And Sam wants to know about mature age people. Are they able to get into university for engineering if they haven't completed high school? You know, there's some of those graduate programs for people. Can you do that?
You can do that.
All right. So, and one person says, I know a graduate who had to go back to a paint shop because he couldn't get a job. Now, is that rare or not? It sounds like it'd be rare, wouldn't it?
It may be. It may be a problem right at the minute if the vacancies are down, but in the long term, it is rare.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your time this morning. And as you heard, if you have an interest in engineering or a child is interested in engineering, contact Engineers Australia, and they'll help you get some work.